Exactly 6 years ago, on exactly this date, I was standing at this exact same place. It was the master thesis that I was presenting that I spent about a year on building. I presented on the subject of business models and hospitals. Business models was something I was acquainted with through the idea that I was active in the startup community, and hospitals was of interest to me because I liked it when people try to make people feel better, act better, and have healthier lives. So my question became, how can these hospitals really do something interesting in their structuring? I was a student of industrial engineering. I was focusing on strategic management. And I thought, well, hey, let's go talk to all these hospitals and see what they're working on. So I spent a lot of time in sessions like these. I did my project in research in coordinates with Nijrode, and that attracted a lot of people to come talk and discuss. And I can clearly remember one of the statements of a very large university hospital director when I did the introduction. And you must remember, I was about 24, 25 when I did this, and all the people in the room were probably over 50 and much older than that even. I did my pitch, and he stood up and he said, just let me clarify. Just before we start this session, and the session was about building business models and other strategic models, he said, this is not how we do business in a hospital. So just let it be known, whatever you're trying is not going to work. So I thought, why is it something that is going to work? Probably because it's a mindset. You're already there thinking that it's not going to work. You have predefined ideas about hospitals, how to take care of people, how to improve people's lives for the better in your mind. So it's going to be a hardship to make that happen in different ways. But I tried anyway. I even wore a suit, which I claimed never to do in my life. And I think this is one of the very few pictures where you see me wearing a suit. You also see I don't look the best of happy in my life, I think. Because I did a lot of other things at that time. It was 2008, and I spent some time in San Francisco, and I worked for a conference called Health 2.0. Health 2.0 was something that merged the ideas of Web 2.0, which was considered to be the next generation of web and technologies, and the merger with the health domain. So how can these internet technologies be applied to the health domain? And I did a small meetup because I thought, let's find some people who think this is interesting. So this is a grainy picture, probably taken with a very old Nokia 9 N95, one of the very early smartphones that was around then. And the fact that there was these early smartphones, there was an early rise of Twitter, there was an interest in improving health through other means, including technology, made it very interesting to put these people together in a room and explore new ideas. Other places where that happened was, for example, Mobile Monday in Amsterdam. I was an active organizer. I moved to Amsterdam for the last 2 years of my study. I spent several years, 6 years in Enschede studying, and I wanted to do an internship in a hospital before I became a hospital advisor, which I was still on track for. And Mobile Monday showed me a very broad range of topics considering synthetic biology, and we'll hear about that probably in one of the later presentations, to emerging countries, to health, which was one of the themes that I added to that, and a broad range, and everybody who was wanting to innovate and take use of these new tools, Twitter, mobile phones, and so on, was there. So for me, it was a very exciting time. And not only here in the Netherlands, it was exciting times, it was also in other places. This is the living room of Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly is one of the founding authors of the Wired magazine. Some of you might know it or even read it. And in the room, you'll find a group of very interesting people. There were about 28 of them. One of the persons you see on the back is Tim Ferriss, author of the book The 4-Hour Body, The 4-Hour Workweek. The people, or the person in the front presenting is Seth Roberts, an experimental psychologist from Berkeley University. And together there was an interest in that group to research the topic which they didn't have a name for at the time. They were interested in these new technologies coming out, the effects they had on people, but also the data they generated. One of the persons actually came late for the meeting, and when asked to tell something about an interesting topic, he said, I can explain why actually I'm late, because I have all this data. I track where I am, I track when I leave, I track how much time I spend in transport, all these things. So the data point became a really interesting side of what they were discussing. And after that meeting, they said, there might be something here, and we need to find a name for it, because once you have a name for something, it starts rolling and you can talk to people about it. And they said, we call it Quantified Self. They meant with Quantified Self that you can track a lot of data and quantify a lot of aspects of your body, yourself, your surroundings, and share that with people in very meaningful ways. So that was actually where Quantified Self, this is 08, so 6 years ago also, actually was born out of. These were some of the notes. These were the notes that Tim Ferriss took during that meeting, and you can see that he was intrigued by the presentation that Seth gave. And Seth said, scientists can tell how to test, and they cannot generate new ideas. Self-experimenting is a tool for generating new ideas. So this idea of self-experimenting became a very interesting feature of the movement. Because of course, this was what Seth Roberts said, the best way to learn is to do. You shouldn't spend years and years researching a topic before you actually come upon something you really want to do, only to find out that it didn't work because you spent too much time thinking about it. He got to that conclusion, for example, when he found out that eating butter made him smarter. He didn't do it on purpose, but he found out that he had an idea that he was better in doing arithmetic and calculations when he ate butter, and he started to experiment, and research it in a way that was more common to normal research, but do it for just the single use case of himself, n equals 1, n of 1. And he found actually very interesting correlations. And Roberts was actually an acclaimed professor of experimental psychology, so he had some knowledge about how this field worked, but he tried to do experiments which even for his field were a bit far off. But there came more out of these experiments. There was a correlation apparently for this use case between even your cholesterol levels, HDL and LDL. There were many things that people were tracking, and the Quantified Self community has grown into a group of people who try to experiment and find out different things of their own health. This is one, Ian Ashlick. I can show you, because you see my presentation is all links in the web browser who you can also follow up on. I can share them with you later so you can find out more about these projects. Is actually a scientist who started to research his own undiagnosed condition. And actually what he found out is that there's so much rigor in research that is also too much rigor for his own good. He just wants to become better himself. He doesn't need all the rigor of scientific process, but he wants to find out things which work for him. But that's not the way most of the scientists or most of the doctors or professionals or others in this field work. This is what happens when you do research. You start a research proposal and you say you started in 2006 and you finalize it in 2012. And look at the upside of that graph, or the upper side of that graph. You missed all these introductions of new technologies. So your plan in 2006 didn't incorporate any of these technologies in your research. And very likely you would have been able to benefit from them if you would have been able to incorporate them. But through the length of research, it's not even possible in a way to do that in meaningful ways. So this group actually grew, and it wasn't an official group, it was a group of people who self-organized. So they came together in every place in the world, in pubs, in universities, in all kinds of meetups. You see that we have about 36,000 members who are officially affiliated, as in they go to the meetup website and they say, I live in Amsterdam, I live in Groningen, I sign up for the meetup and I'll come join. But there are actually many more. There's many companies, so we do it in Amsterdam. There are many companies who do this, but we always ask 3 questions. What did you do, how did you do it, and what did you learn? We're not interested in did it work for 100 people, or did you do a double-blind controlled trial, or did you do a randomized controlled trial. All of that is interesting, but it's another perspective. We like to see what did you do and how did you do it. Some things I did was I started taking pictures of my life every day. I started taking one picture actually at 8:36. I did it because somebody else did it at 8:36 and he did it because somebody else did it. So there's no real chain of how it started exactly at 8:36. But I found out that actually, if you go through my life, I can go back and I share these pictures and I get an interesting perspective on my life that I hadn't noticed before. Sometimes I think I'm sitting in front of the television way too much, but other people who I share these pictures from just see the pictures apparently that show when I'm traveling or show that when they think I'm doing interesting stuff. Or my mom calls me when I miss one picture and she tries to figure out whether I'm ill, whether I've disappeared off the planet, and so on. So there's actually interesting side effects that happen, which I didn't intend to find out, but I found out actually anyways by doing this project. So I didn't start with a clear-cut goal, but it sort of developed during these sessions. I didn't start tracking my migraine. This is an example picture of an app I use possible to use for tracking anything. And by tracking, I just mean you slide it on your phone, you check in on an action. And the action can be that you've attended a class, or that you've read the newspaper, or that you went for a run, or that you had a migraine attack. I did it to track my toilet visits. And although it sounds like the most weird thing, why I did it was actually very interesting to me, but just to me. I found out that in the middle of important meetings, I had to stand up and go to the toilet because, well, actually I didn't know what it was because of. I thought it was because I figured out that I was probably drinking too much coffee or water before I went into the meeting, but I wasn't sure. I didn't see the relationship. I didn't figure out what it was. So I started tracking it. And where you expect a story of that, I'll now show you graphs and ideas about what happened and what the relationship with how much water I drank or how much coffee I drank will come next. It actually turned out to be very efficient within almost a week and a half. Because what I found out is I tried to force myself to check in every time I did that. But the mental process that went to work was actually I started checking in, and I started to find out that only when I checked in, I became aware of what actually was that I wanted to do in the meeting, or that I even was in sort of the meeting, because I came from another meeting, I went to the next meeting. I was so hushed that I actually didn't have a real clue of preparing the right things before the meeting, doing the right stuff. And so the active act of tracking alone and experimenting with that made me so much more aware of what I was doing that I found out my main problem was not preparing for the meetings at all. It didn't have to do much with whether I drank enough coffee or not. It should be about, do I prepare? So do I need to go before I go into the meeting? Do I know that I can get out of this meeting because it's not so important that they won't mind if I leave in the middle? Do I do enough preparation? So it was a different one. It wasn't completely surrounded with the data. But there is, of course, a lot of stuff that is surrounded with data because it's a very interesting perspective. This is my scale at my home. And the scale is anything a normal scale is but a little smarter, being connected to my Wi-Fi. So this is my data from the last 3 years concerning my weight. And I can show you exactly that this shows, and it also shows not only in the decrease in my weight, but also in the amount of times that I measure myself. These are very active periods where I'm trying to figure out if I can get my weight back under control by, for example, going for a run. And especially when it goes well, you see that I try to stand on the scale before the run, after the run, the next morning, because I become very enthusiastic about my weight loss. But then again, here you see no measurements at all, and you see the correlation between the fact I don't measure, because probably this is where it happens when I travel. I tend not to restrict myself to any diet or do anything special, and back up it goes. But this helps me to tell a story to my doctor when I'm in a doctor's office, who's trying to figure out how to keep it under control. But otherwise, I should have to say, I don't have any data. I can tell you some stories, some stories here and other stories there, but there isn't a continuous line of data I can show you. Now I can. I can even do that without any interaction myself. This app runs on the back, actually on the background on my phone continuously. And what it does, it tracks where I go, it tracks how much I move, and it tracks what type of movement it is. So what you get out of that is, for example, this. I live in Amsterdam, somewhere in the city center, and this is where I walk. And this is actually the data in Amsterdam, and I can zoom out, of course, but I can also show where I go for a run. And I can show you how much I cycle, because there's much more cycling going. And I can even show you, zooming out, how much there is if you look at, for example, where I've been in the last year and a half in the Netherlands and abroad. This data I now try to use, which is not finished yet, for an experiment trying to figure out my motivational levels. I know that there's days that I move less, that I don't visit any spaces in particular besides my home, and I can correlate it with other data I have, for example, how much I watch Netflix, how much I exercise, and all the other data together give me a better story to tell to others if I try to explain what motivates me or what doesn't. I have things set up which work continuously in the background without any interaction when I enter my office, when I'm at home, what times, how often, and so on, without any specifics. I don't even know yet what I'm going to use the data for, but I know by capturing it now, I can already relate to it in a future product so that I have it at the ready. And I think in a community like that, you come upon some very courageous people. Remco Siemering was one of the courageous people who tried to explain his story of bipolar disorder, mapping it to the music he was listening to. The beats in the music, the frequency of the times that he listened to, the types of artists he tried to map, if he could spot his bipolar depression coming on, but also that he could tell others to spot these same patterns and to help him make sense of that and even correct or help him out before the bipolar disorder would kick in. Another example is a lady called Sara. Sara Rigare is from Sweden, and she has a very specific form of Parkinson's disease. And she found an app on the App Store that helped her find out how specific that disease was prevalent during that day. She had an app where she could tap the phone and find out if it was she had a very bad tremor, or so to say, a very stiff fingers, or not. And by mapping that data throughout the day and mapping it also to the medication that she was taking, she could tell her doctor what would be the suggested times to take her medication during the day. She took several medications several times a day, but she rather switched some of her medication before the lunch because that would make it easier for her throughout the day to not have many more problems with her rigor altogether. All through the fact of self-experimenting, finding new ways that don't work maybe for all the people in the room, but it definitely worked for her. Another one is someone in our community who did the fistful diet, basically by assessing how much food he ate by comparing it to the size of his fist. So he knew that when he was eating, he said, this plate holds about 2 fistfuls of food. And you see what the correlation is because you show 2 lines on this graph. The one line actually is his weight, and the other one is how many times or how many fistfuls of food he was eating. Again, this doesn't mean that it works for everybody, but it did work for him. And there should be some value in the fact that people are trying to find out their own ways to do experimental research and to take value from that. Talking about experimental research, I think one of the interesting examples, Nancy is a good friend and currently one of the engineers on the Apple iWatch team, did an experiment with what she called mindfulness pills. These pills are starch pills, Z-meal. They don't do anything specific. She tried to figure out the placebo effect by labeling them specific, talking about things like calm, energy, focus, and so on, and then taking the pills and trying to research how well she was doing, for example, by measuring her heart rate or looking at her activities. And what she found out is that it's very clear that there is an effect, even though the pills don't do anything special, because she could measure the effect, she could see the activity levels that she was having, and so on. So these experiments try to indicate something that is very uncommon in larger research, and I think many of you will be currently participating in research or maybe want even a career out of research, and I think it's good to think about how these large-scale experiments are not maybe always the best ways of our knowledge in terms of gathering the data and being relevant to people. Of course, there's much more interest in many domains. Many technology players like Apple, but I can name many more, are trying to find their ways in this domain. There's companies who make data gathering tools which allow us to gather data in ways such as Scanadu. It's a device, you see it here, Sam, the founder actually from Belgium, is showing that you put it on your forehead and you can gather blood pressure, heart rate data, temperature and blood oxygen from one single device for just under $200. So there's many more data points coming available for us to play with, to experiment with, and to make assessments based upon. I'll show you 2 final things which I think are interesting. You can also do this on a larger scale. Of course, when you have the N of 1 data, you can do it if you recognize this is Barcelona. And Barcelona has a harbor at the bottom of Barcelona. And in '86, an article was published in The Lancet talking about people finding out asthma problems. And the doctors mapped them with pencil and paper on a map, and they found out on Tuesdays and Thursdays there was a prevalence of more asthma cases than normal. It turned out to be the soil transfer of the ships in the harbor was causing people to have air problems or airway problems. Now there is actually a company who can make this much easier by putting a sensor on top of your asthma inhaler and locating where you are and when you are taking your asthma inhaler. So they can produce a global map of people with asthma problems, specifying the region where they are, specifying the problems that they have, and giving the data back to the people individually, but also to public services that can manage their data better in a way. So what I'm trying to do is start small, and by starting small I'll tell you one thing about my last experiment, which is trying to experiment with technology inside your body rather than only on the outside of your body. So the last experiment I did was implant a chip in my skin. You can feel it if it's about here. You can see a little bit there, which is basically a very simple chip. It doesn't do anything special, but what it does, it can open my door, it can start my car, it can unlock my phone. It's an RFID chip, and if you hack it the right ways, you can probably even check in with your OV chip card or other things by just touching a device which reads your chip and then gets your identity from that. But the thing is, it's not a very intelligent chip, and that's especially what I'm looking for. I want to start with the smallest thing possible, because it makes it so much easier to progress from the smallest thing possible to the next thing. So what will be next after we looked at data from the outside? What data do we have on the inside? I wouldn't put a thing like this under my skin right now. I can show you, this is the last slide I will do, about this size, but I will show it to you. After I've done this, it becomes much easier. So try to do the smallest thing possible, and the best way to learn is really to do. Thanks.